I would now like to introduce our first keynote speaker for today. Professor Craig Calhoun from University of Arizona State University is a professor of social sciences. He was previously president and director of the London School of Economics, president of the Social Science Research Council and the Berggruen Institute, and at various times a professor, dean, department chair, and institute director at UNC-Chapel Hill, Columbia, and NYU. He received his doctorate from Oxford University and has been a visiting professor in China, Eritrea, France, Germany, Norway, Sudan, and the UK. Professor Calhoun's newest book is called Degenerations of Democracies. He's joining us live from Arizona, USA. It is our pleasure to welcome you, Professor Calhoun. The floor is yours.
I wish that I were in Cyprus. I wish that I were with you to enjoy and learn about and see the Turkish community of Cyprus, to see the ways in which you are collectively building civil society. I want to begin, and I hope I will succeed in sharing slides with some conceptual questions that are, I think, important, and then turn to some questions of what is not civic life and some challenges that we face and that are important to think about today. One of the challenges for building civil society is managing new technologies. There are worse challenges than simply older, incompetent social scientists who are slow to get their screens to share and their PowerPoints to play. There are challenges of surveillance. There are challenges of massive control of our lives, as it were, behind our backs. So if I am now able to share, and you are able to see this, we can go ahead. Civic Space, the project that you've committed yourselves to, exists in a very uncivic world. So I don't need to tell you that you are building something against pressures. The CiviCon project, Reclaiming Truth, Reinventing the Commons, Reimagining Civic Space, is a good cause. It's important, but it is an uphill struggle. Fortunately, as I've said, I think much of the struggle can be sociable, solidaristic, and fun. It's a saving grace that it's actually enjoyable to come together with colleagues and work on projects of civic society. It can be hard work, it can be challenging, and I'm going to talk about some of the pressures with which it must contend, but it can succeed partly because it is not just building something else for other people to enjoy, but is in the very practice of creating civil society an enjoyable civil life. Now, civic life, I want to suggest, following an old theoretical distinction, has certain key characteristics. And it's all the more important that I not try to say everything here because we've gotten a late start and we'll run out of time. But let me stress, civic life is first about being self-organized among citizens. There are various ways to organize life, but civic is specifically self-organized. It's oriented to common purposes. Not all of life is organized with regard to purposes, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But in order to have common purposes, we have to have communication and debate about what those purposes should be. It's a distinct thing to organize with goals and purposes and commitments. Let me use an academic example. Universities exist for a variety of purposes, but usually forget that. They usually begin to exist simply to continue to exist, to recruit students and graduate them, to be prestigious, to be well-ranked, and they forget their purposes of supporting common understanding among citizens, the capacity to create a democratic society, the moral agendas of the people who make them up, and the future well-being of citizens. Universities serve civic life more when they remember their purposes and when they are open to partnerships with others to define purposes. They forget the common purposes when they are obsessed with rankings and rivalries among other universities, or simply their standing in a larger whole. Now, this isn't a talk about universities. That's an attempt simply to say that when we work in civil society, when we self-organize groups, when we orient ourselves to common purposes, it's crucial to stop and reflect about those purposes and to do that over and over again. Civic life is also differentiated. It reflects the plural identities and interests of citizens. You all represent a range of different views. It's public, not in the sense of being part of the state, but in the sense of being open. And it requires openness. It requires openness to people with whom we disagree and openness to those who are newly entering the debate. Civic life, then, is one form of solidarity, and it's not the only one. There are other forms of being connected to each other that are not solidaristic and shared. An old Roman distinction of communitas, societas, civitas, emphasized some differences. And let me just borrow it to stress. Civic life, right, is not the same as community. Community is valuable, good, and may be an important basis for civil society, but it's often a pre-political unity that does not involve reflection, debate, identification of purpose, and is not equally open to diversity. So we need to benefit from community, but complement it with a life of civic associations and activism. We find community organized in small scale in our lives, but we need to connect it to our pursuit of larger public interest and often politics of the civic. Similarly, we are organized in society by law, by a variety of formal agreements and contracts, by economic organizations and corporate life. These two are not civic life. Right? Civic life is one realm of integration of society, one form of solidarity and sharing in which we pursue common interests, in which we act voluntaristically. Let me try to make this clearer with a contrast to some of what is not civic. Right? The not civic, right, is anti-solidaristic, violence instead of discussion, exclusion instead of inclusion. It's impersonal, right? The very large scale in which people cannot be known. The civic realm depends on people entering it as persons and then organizing ways of interrelating at larger scale. The systemic, markets, and other kinds of non-linguistic steering media, as a phrase from mid-20th century sociology has it. That is, ways in which connections are formed, right, that are not open to collective remaking of their purpose. And finally, what I want to focus on, the kind of nationalism that treats being part of the nation as pure inheritance, rather than as participation in a continuous remaking of shared history. Last year, more than 60 countries held general elections. There was a mood of seeking change. Sometimes the change went to the left, more often to the right, but almost everywhere, nationalism was central, and a new nationalism was increasingly powerful, which emphasized the always already formed character of nations, emphasized what is inherited from the past and common culture, and not what is chosen and created anew today. But in fact, right, what civil society can bring to our thinking and bring to the future of our countries is the idea that we are able to remake what we have inherited from the past, including basic national commonalities. The nationalism that was so prominent last year and is even more prominent in many ways this year was partly persistence. That is, it was partly old and just continuing, but it was not all old and continuing. It was a resurgence. Right? Nations matter now in a variety of ways in new contexts, and they matter partly because we are afraid of disorganization, of conflict, of crises, of war. Right? We're afraid of loss of culture. We're afraid even of families getting smaller and demographic crises. Right? So nationalism can reflect a positive hope for trying to make the world better together, but coming out of fear, it commonly reflects the seeking of an always already formed idea of solidarity, of a shelter in what we inherit rather than the creativity of what is new. Right? Many nationalists, right, invoke the people, but they do not create the conditions for the people to actively choose their future in common discussions, in creative explorations of different ways to be together. They impose from the top down a variety of visions of how everything should be in a national society based on their understandings of common culture, right, rather than on the citizens' differentiated, plural, heterogeneous interactions with each other through civil society groups. Right? Now, nationalism is not and never has been simply the same as right-wing populism. It's organized differently from the world of populism. And when it is organized differently, it can be a basis for democracy and republicanism. Right? So I am self-consciously in this talk avoiding trying to pretend that I know your world and give you slides and pictures of Cyprus. Rather, I'm trying to suggest that in the world at large, there are examples of, in this case, nationalism that issues in democracy. So we don't have to be afraid of being national. What we have to do is think about ways to be national that also support the civic, which, as I've suggested already, is necessarily a realm of plurality and differentiation, working through multiple organizations and identities to create a larger whole. Okay. I've talked about this in a book. I'm not going to repeat everything I had to say there with my colleagues, but it is a double message that large-scale democracy depends on national cohesion and solidarity, but that we can get national cohesion and solidarity in ways that are open to collective work to remake, through our common purposes, how we live together rather than inheritance. We have opportunities for solidarity or exclusion. Right? In many countries, including my own, one of the problems has been that we have included others but not fully assimilated others, thinking that assimilation involved imposing an already formed common culture, say the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture in America. Many have said, oh, we should not call on immigrants to join in the common culture. This is not helpful for a civic society approach, which requires that everyone join, but not necessarily that they sacrifice all of their distinctive identity. By creating, in many European countries and in the United States, a range of separate communities within the larger whole, and notice the word community that I'm emphasizing, we have often turned the inclusive project of welcoming immigrants into a project that undermines integration of the country. Civil society is not about the exclusion of people who are different, but about finding ways to include, incorporate, and connect to people who come from different backgrounds, but join in the process of forming and reshaping common culture. There's a need in this for inclusive solidarities, for the ability to say we, not only with the people we already agree with, but across lines of difference. I don't know what happened to the picture that was there. I'll offer two quotations as a reflection, using my own country as an example, of a shifting attitude that is worrying. Ronald Reagan, a famous American president who was for a long time the most popular voice of conservatism before he was three-quarters forgotten by the contemporary American movements, made a contrast to France and said, you can go live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. That's the proposition of inclusion. Right? Now, it may not be entirely fair to France, which has included many immigrants, but it reflects something of the tension between points of view of those who say we can never succeed in integrating these immigrants and those who say we must. Contrast this to the current American vice president, who has said, America is not just an idea. We're a particular place with a particular people, with a particular set of beliefs and way of life. That is a homeland. It is, in short, a nation. So here is an understanding of the nation that is fixed and inherited rather than fluidly being remade through the work of a plurality of citizens. Nationalism can emphasize unity prior to choice, or it can emphasize choice. It can emphasize the differentiation into different groups and identities, or a de-differentiated whole. And there's lots of symbolic, often banal ways in which national identities get reproduced through the Olympics, through flags, through stamps. Maps and statistics encourage us to believe that these nations that we focus on are given almost in nature, at least by common history, right? But conflict is part of nations. Remake them. And conflict's part of the civic. We try to minimize violent conflict, but we accept that people will have arguments, that they do not just come together and agree about everything, they come together and debate. Nations do not exist naturally. The world is not organized by nature into these maps with all of the common territories and the sharp lines dividing the different territories. This is a practice we have of putting nation in place, of reproducing this way of seeing the world, which underestimates others, right? It creates conflicts and fears over whether one nation or another will win out in this. We need to minimize this kind of conflict in order to be able to have open collective discussion about common future. And in fact, it's often the business of states to encourage wars and conflicts in order to discourage civic life at home and the construction of new identities. Right? We need culture not to just be the production of sameness and not to always be entwined with material power and physical force, but to be a realm of difference and creativity as well as solidarity. The solidarity that matters most is often with people different from us. We are brought together by building national markets and infrastructures, but then what will we do with this? That's the question of civil society. But in this context, there has been a resurgence of a kind of nationalism that I suggest is a basic problem now for civil society. To repeat, celebrating that we live in a shared nation can be a support for civil society if, but only if, it comes with an acceptance of plurality and choice, of the potential for continuing to remake and renew our nations and make them better. If our nationalism doesn't do this, it can be at odds with the projects of civil society and collective purpose. So we need a resurgence of active and diverse civil society that can complement and sometimes counter forms of nationalism that say the ways in which we are supposed to live together have already been established by our inheritance from earlier identities. This requires that we have spaces where people can mix. And I'm editing out of talk on the basis of time here, some illustration of this. But I think you know, and you know intuitively from your own lives and practices, that civil society, civic society indeed, can't flourish without access to spaces in which people have freedom to mix in new ways. Large public spaces, but access to small spaces. Civil society is famously built in squares and plazas, but also in coffee shops and small group discussion. Civil society requires groups that people are able to form and have recognized different groups, and also to remake these groups, like all of the different voluntary associations through which you come together in the CiviCon project, which may get funding from the European Union, but are not themselves the state. They are independent groups. Civic society requires will and determination, and it requires a skilled practice. The trainings and learnings of CiviCon are part of a practice in not just receiving identities, like national identities, but in creating new identities through interaction with others in our nation and sometimes beyond it. Much of the ideology of nationalism today is explicitly post-liberal. It says that liberal society has failed, and I agree it has in many ways failed. We have tolerated far too much inequality in the name of liberal freedom, and we have to respond. But this post-liberalism has brought together a range of voices that share an emphasis on the inherited past identities and a discouragement of the creation of new ways of organizing common life through civic society. Those voices of people who write books are matched by voices of people who lead in politics and try to organize through movements and through the use of the government a form of commonality that is not differentiated and plural and created out of the diverse purposes of civic groups, but imposed through the mass media and political means. This new wave of nationalists are in fact joined by international ties. There is a kind of internationale of nationalists meeting regularly with an annual National Conservative Conference to organize this project of nationalism. Part of the challenge of others is to be comparably organized about civic nationalism to the ways they are organized about ethnic nationalism. That is, it's not necessarily the case that one has to be post-national or anti-national. It is the case that if one wants to choose the quality of national existence that you will share with your fellow citizens, it requires organization. Movement intellectuals have set the stage for this nationalist resurgence. For those who follow left and right-wing politics, it's been an odd and dizzying movement because it is now the right that cites thinkers like Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse as the American rightist, the man who created the media network that Steve Bannon went on to link, said, politics is downstream from culture. This is a kind of paraphrase of Gramsci. Right? Politics is not just a matter of competing with clear interests and identities. It is a matter of remaking the interests and identities as we make them public and bring them out. These ethnic nationalists have in many ways seized the initiative, but civic national identity has the chance also to remake politics and remake culture at the same time, to reshape our identities and our collective work together. The new right-wing nationalism has brought together, right, often racist, heavy metal rock music, religious currents, theoretical ideas. It is an intelligible theory that, for the most part, thinkers on the left and in the liberal center of societies have condemned as bad, but also ignored and not understood. These various thinkers, Julius Evola, the Italian who's seen as a great ancestor, in the upper left of the screen, Steve Bannon, the current American populist agitator below him, and long a media producer, Alexander Dugin, the Russian advisor to Putin and theorist of Eurasian society and expansive Eurasianism, right? These and many, many others, including in the previous picture, have ideas. They are bringing forward new ideas. They are organizing in ways that we need to understand, I want to suggest, and they are responding to real challenges. There really is a challenge to family. Communities really are undermined by international corporate capitalism and an emphasis on the large-scale markets and not local solidarities. If you are buying only from distant warehouses through computerized media with no main street, this is undermining community. Now, community may need to be built a different way, and this is where civic action comes in. Civic action brings together people who say, well, in this new economic situation, how can we revitalize what used to be the commercial center of our town so that people come there and gather and mix with each other, so that the nationalist message of the thinkers I'm now showing on the screen isn't the only message about how we can create new life together. Other nationalisms are still possible. Let me stop here and invite questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Calhoun. We have some time for a couple of questions. I just want to make a quick request. If you are going to ask your question in Turkish, please speak slowly so that we can translate, because we need to translate the question for Professor Calhoun. So if anybody has a question, please let us know so we can give you the microphone. And please use the microphone, otherwise we cannot have translation. Thank you.
Thank you for this inspiring speech. I have a question in my mind for a while. How can we promote active and diverse civil society when there is very restricted spaces? Like, because you said that one of the requirements is free space, groups, wills, and practice. But of course, like when you look at the new indicators under the VDEM, now the VDEM democracy, now we can see that, you know, most of the spaces are very restricted. How can we do this, you know, under very restricted spaces and in practice? I totally agree that theoretically, you know, we should do that. But in reality, empirically, how can we promote this? What will be the mechanisms to do that? Thank you very much.
It's a wonderful question. And I wish that I had an almost magic solution. So spaces have become unfree partly because governments and others have made them unfree. This may be a matter of policing spaces and what goes on in them. And so there are responses to vibrant, active public gatherings that involve cracking down through police and making space less free. It may be a matter of architectural design, and one thing to do is to watch out for anti-public design of public spaces. For example, it has become a common practice reproduced among architects working for governments to organize public spaces so that there is restricted entrance and access, so that it's easier for police to control crowds, so that benches and other barriers are put up not just to provide convenient places for people to sit, but to make it difficult to form a larger crowd and for that crowd to move. And on, there are a variety of design levels. Spaces that were one level or two are being reconstructed to have 3 or 4 or 5 different levels. So one thing to do is to call attention to and resist efforts to remake public space in ways that inhibit public gathering of groups and are designed only to encourage a flow of individuals through the space, and at worst, a flow of cars that makes it hard for pedestrians and others on foot. So that's my first. That's hard because it's people with power who are hiring the architects who are doing the redesign. It's hard to resist. Second thing is that some kinds of private spaces become public. This is the story of coffee houses historically. But it is also a story sometimes of kitchens in which people gather around a table. And it's necessary in forming groups to find ways to be able to use private spaces to gather in order to form groups for public purposes. But I don't have a magic solution. It is a crucial question. I could extend this to metaphorical spaces in the media. And there is here too some potential for openness, but a lot of change in how media spaces are organized and policed, and they sometimes become dangerous because they are so open to surveillance that activists using these media expose themselves to considerable risks. So it's important to take account of that and to work on it, but not to give up on finding ways to come together and forge solidarity.
Thank you, Professor Calhoun, for your answer. We will take a second question over here, please.
Hello. Thank you, Professor. That was a very thought-provoking input. Can you please help me understand? You are presenting nationalism. You said that it's not the same as right-wing populism. But if I understood correctly from the images and examples you gave us, there's seem to be very toxic nationalism. So can you please clarify if you see nationalism being divided into benign nationalism and malign nationalism? Or did I misunderstand something? Thank you.
No, I'm sorry I was unclear. You understood correctly. My point in saying not all nationalism is right-wing populism was to remind us that national identities can be important and valuable in our lives and can be part of democratic society. So the point is not to be anti-national. The point is to examine and usually to resist versions of nationalism that repress civic life, that repress difference, that say that the proper identity of the nation has already been established in the past and is just inherited, and so we should just follow it, rather than that living together in a national society, we have the opportunity to remake the purposes of the nation and the way in which national identity is constructed to be more inclusive, for example. And here I don't mean just inclusive of outsiders, such as immigrants. I mean for the nation to be inclusive of different groups that understand their lives differently, but are all part of the nation.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have one more question. We can take one more question at the back. If I could kindly ask you to stand up, please, so we can see you. Thank you.
Hello, Professor. Thank you again for your presentation. It was enlightening. You had a point where you said to be careful when we were working on media or how we use it. I wanted to ask, especially with younger generation, media and online technologies become more and more used, and it becomes a tool. What sort of suggestion can you make for us to use this more effectively for civic society?
Okay. Again, this is a really important question. There are problems with new media, but there are also great capacities, and there is no option of simply not using any of the new media and creating larger civic society and movements. But the media have in many ways become less free. In the early years of social media, there was a lot of faith that this would inherently promote freedom, that this would inherently make it more possible for there to be a clear organization of public discussion and debate that enabled citizens to not only present their views, but to learn from each other and change their views. Now, that's still possible and a goal, but we've learned that there is the use of artificial intelligence. There are deep fakes which create distorting pictures. So you can't believe everything you see. That use the voices of people to say things that are not really them. That flood social media sites with messages that are organized by bots, by small numbers of people. So sometimes, you'll notice I have white hair and a white beard. People much younger than me are better. They have better skills, but not always. And it's crucial to develop those skills. So when we think about the skills that are crucial to building civic society, it's crucial to make the skills of dealing with the media a important part of this. And this means not just how do we, the good guys, use the media effectively, but how do we recognize what's problematic about certain media when they are, for example, being heavily changed by artificial intelligence. I'm afraid that my prediction here, I'm actually working on this a bit at the moment, is that there will be vastly more artificial intelligence, and it will be used by some state and other actors to promote certain messages, but above all, it will be deployed through a logic of engagement that is trying to make everybody addicted to certain kinds of interaction with largely artificial AI counterparts who, and this is already an issue. If you are on a social media site, you don't know the extent to which you are interacting with a real person or a fake. Now, to know better, to exercise critical judgment is important, right? So civic society 200 years was a matter of speeches and trying to understand beyond just speeches. It became a matter of newspapers, and people developed skills of critically reading the newspapers, even in repressive societies where the newspapers were not free, trying to read between the lines. We need skills of this kind to live in this mass-mediated society. So the first part of the answer is work together on building the skills and awareness of the challenges of this new media landscape, as well as learning how to use the media in it. But then second is don't forget the face-to-face. There is no possible future for successful civic society and civic national understandings that is only large-scale mediated and not face-to-face. Building face-to-face groups remains critical to civic society. And it's often through face-to-face groups where people discuss with each other what they see online, that there is a critical consciousness and awareness. Oh, that was a fake, or in more complicated ways. This is a message that's being promoted by certain people. Why? So we need to complement the online with the face-to-face, and part of the work of civic society is to make sure that we have a lot of face-to-face groups in which people are able to carry out these discussions.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Calhoun. I just want to remind everyone that he's joining us live from Arizona, and it's very late at night there, so we really want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and being with us today. I would like to thank the participants who also asked their questions. I want to remind you all that we're about to go on a 15-minute coffee break. Please use this coffee break as time to visit some of the CSO stands outside. And we'll meet you back in 15 minutes. And a massive thanks again to Professor Calhoun. Thank you.
Thank you.